Yuma, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar discussing the voice. This is the third in a series looking at different aspects of this process, and I'm hoping that you'll get involved in the conversations over the course of this next hour and the days and weeks ahead leading up to the close of this component of consultations at the end of the month. I'm Dan Borshner. It's great to be with you as facilitator of this conversation with a fantastic panel today looking at some aspects of the local and regional voice design. But I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people who have managed and maintained culture, connection to country and language, and pass on the stories and share that with me in the media, with all of us in the community. I particularly want to pay respects to your custodians wherever you're joining us around this great nation today. And I'd like to acknowledge my own elders who have mentored and nurtured me from my own family, but from so many friends. Some of them are with us today. So I want to pay all those respects. We are very grateful. This is a big discussion that we're having at a time of big discussions. And I want to also acknowledge that today there are a number of rallies for justice happening around the country about how we treat each other, how women in particular are treated. And for me, this is all about those people gathering to have a voice. And that's exactly what we're doing, having a voice and being heard. So I just want to acknowledge that as we get started today. With us is a cracking panel. First, I've got Professor Peter Buckskin, PSM, who's in Adelaide, was on the local and regional co-design group as co-chair, is a Narranga man from York Peninsula in South Australia, a member of the Lowacha Institute Board of Directors and a former Dean of Aboriginal Engagement and Strategic Projects at the University of South Australia. Yuma, Professor, great to have you along. Ms. Ruth Davies is in Albury. She was a group member on the local and regional co-design, a Wiradjuri woman, former chairperson of the Riverina Murray Region Alliance, co-founder and CEO of marketing and product developer of Gillian Dallingang, an entirely Aboriginal-owned business partnership specialising in Wiradjuri language education services and also resources. Ruth, marvellous to have you along. How are you?
You're Marang, Dan. I'm great, thank you.
Outstanding. And also with us, Chris Ingrave in Sydney, a local and regional co-design group member, a Dungari and Dharawal descent, a man of Dharawal and Dungari descent from the La Perouse Aboriginal community in Sydney. He's the CEO of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council, a director of the Inner Sydney Empowered Communities and Eastern Zone Gajaga Aboriginal Corporation, and was a previous director of the La Perouse Local Aboriginal Land Council and has led significant reforms to the governance and economic development of the La Perouse Aboriginal community. Yuma, Chris, great to have you here as well.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here and I look forward to our discussion today.
We're going to get underway with this conversation in just a tick, but first I wanted to show you a short video just to give you a sense of where we're at.
A local and regional voice would be a governance structure at the regional level. It would be designed and led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities in each region. This will be guided by the proposed principles-based framework. Each local and regional voice would provide advice to all levels of government. This includes the Australian government, state or territory governments, and local governments. Advice from a local and regional voice would be on what's important to communities across its region. Local and regional voices could also work in partnership with all levels of government on how to improve local services and deliver on community priorities. This approach is sometimes referred to as shared decision-making. A key role for each local and regional voice would be ongoing engagement with local communities, groups, organisations and other stakeholders across their region. This will ensure its work reflects the views, priorities and aspirations of local people. Local and regional voices would also provide advice to the national voice on national issues. They would not manage government programs or funding, nor replace or undermine existing bodies. No one set structure is proposed for local and regional voices. Different regions could design different local and regional voice governance structures, depending on what works best for them, guided by the framework. Traditional owners living on country as well as all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents in a region, would be able to be involved.
And so this gives us a sense of these deliberations, the discussions. Getting here was over 12 months, 52 co-design members from around the nation in 3 different advisory groups worked together to develop the proposals that have been put forth in the interim report that is available on the website of voice.niaa.gov.au. Submissions of this component are still open until the 31st of this month, so just a couple of weeks away. And I would encourage you to get a submission in and be a part of this conversation. To get started with the panel, I just want to find out about a bit of reflection on the deliberations of the process of getting to this point. I'll start with you first, Peter. What's your observations about getting here?
Well, I've been really pleased with the emphasis that we've had on research over the last number of decades, where we've been trying to create a voice to government and respond to all the reports that have come together to this stage where we're focusing on developing a voice as a part of a process to, I suppose, bring to government and to its institutions priorities that we think as Aboriginal people through our voices.
Ruth, I wonder if you want to weigh into that about your observations.
I agree with Peter. There's been a lot of work done in the past. So we had to research and I suppose look at what has happened in the past, why it may not have worked, or, what were some of the challenges faced. I think what I reflect a lot on is that we all come with varying views and we all come from different levels as well. So there was a lot of conversation and I think Peter and Chris both agree there was robust conversation at times. So people were allowed to put their points of view forward. And I think what we were able to also do was to talk to grassroots community members to get their points of view. What would they think of this? What would they ask of this? So, I think there was a lot of conversation that got us to this point.
Chris, some robust conversations there?
Yeah, there was quite a lot. What I really enjoyed out of this process was it was around building on what existing governance arrangements are in place across Australia. So it wasn't to duplicate or take over what's existing there, and whatever's been built in communities at the moment, as I said, it was to build on top of that. And I really like that approach because across Australia we see at a local and regional level some things working really well, and this is just to build on that. And the environmental scan that the local and regional co-design group did also shows, which we'll probably touch on, but shows where some areas of the country, some state and territories are doing things really well, and where other state and territories across the country can really adopt some of the learnings and experiences from those communities.
Peter, one of the components that has been touched on in that video, also in this report, is around the value that there's not one size fits all. How does that sit in informing this conversation?
Look, I think that's the whole strength, Dan, of the proposal. That we've looked at all the different types of approaches. Aboriginal communities are involved in, and as Chris was saying, we're not replacing that, we're trying to enhance that. So we're paying respect to work done before and lessons learnt, and to ensure that we respond to the needs of the regional and local communities. So there's not one model for all the regional and diversity of our people around Australia. Every region will look different based on their circumstances, and we're very committed to ensuring. Sorry, the power just went off behind me. We're very keen ensuring that their voices are heard. One of our members talked about families and communities need to see their priorities in this voice and see us acknowledging that. And I think we've got a process in place with the principle-based framework to ensure that we pay respect to those individual and collective voices at the regional level.
Thanks for persevering with that power outage. We're going to be stopping hearing your voice, which is good. Ruth, just on that point around how these bodies would communicate, I guess a component that struck me as I was reading the report was about how each of them, regardless of the kind of individual makeup, would still be able to talk to different levels of government, different service providers. How important is that?
Well, in the past, we as Aboriginal people have had programs delivered to us. So it really is about sort of a partnership approach instead of being, can I use the words, being dictated to. This is about us being able to relay the message up again. So I think, many programs and services are offered at the local and regional level, and that has to happen. If without that, this would be futile, really. It's essential that they're involved, and we've looked and learnt from all past approaches, and we know that only one level of government isn't going to be the answer. We know that it has to be local, it has to be regional, it has to be state-based, and it has to be national. We know that we need to work with local, state and territory governments in a coordinated way and for our communities.
On that note, Chris, in your community, there's both the empowered communities model that's been discussed a lot over the last decade or so, and local decision-making arrangements, I guess, that are already in place. Can you give us a sense of the benefits of having different options, different models or ways of communicating like that?
Yeah, it's so it allows us to have pretty much place-based decision-making by our community. And at the same time, we have, at the moment, the state and federal government at the table. So our priorities that our community want to see under local decision-making or empowered communities are the same. Before, we just had empowered communities and we didn't have local decision-making or regional alliance. And it just meant that we were only working with the Australian government. Now that local decision-making, we're a local decision-making site with the New South Wales government, it just means both governments are at the same table with our community leaders and our community members. So it limits duplication. It ensures that we have a greater say on program delivery and service delivery within our community. And it really stops and limits the shop around that government used to do with our organisations and community members in the past. So, and in addition, the one thing that I've always been excited about, it's brought our people, it's unified our organisations, our decision makers within those organisations, and we're all now on the same page, moving forward and working together. Where that wasn't, I couldn't say that happened very effectively in the past. So some of the consultations we've done in Sydney, in Western Sydney, they talked about the voice in the designing a local and regional voice is they could see where it could unify communities.
I think it's a really good point about unifying communities. Peter, I want to start with you, but open this up to the whole panel, that there are differing levels of governance structures, as we've just heard from Chris, in different communities. You'll have seen this in your lifetime, in your career, working in this very arena. So I guess the question that I've seen online a bit where people are asking is what's the starting point if you are a community with a very strong governance framework compared to a community that might not have as strong or a governance framework at all?
Dan, I think it's really important that we reflect on the process being a co-design process. So it's where the community is and local or the regional community is at, and then to build on from that. So where there is limited structures in place, we're going to have a transitional period where we would work with the community about establishing a local and building up to a regional voice. But it is about co-designing. It is about building on what is there, and where there are gaps identified by the community, we will work with the community about developing that process. I think it's really important, as we've learned just in the last couple of conversations I've had with our face-to-face consultations, is local government seems to be a really missing part of this, of involved in the co-design process, and people want to see local governments being more responsive to the needs of the local Aboriginal communities. And so that's something that we will reflect on and build to ensure that at the local level, non-Indigenous local government arrangements are working with the local stakeholders in their governance arrangements to create a pathway forward.
Ruth, what about you around the starting points that might be at very different levels for different communities?
They're exactly right. There is going to be very different starting points. And for an example, I can use the Riverina Murray Regional Alliance. They're already an alliance under the LDM initiative of state that has been set up. They hold 10 communities or speak and represent those 10 communities. So I think they're already at a very good starting point. But again, as Peter said, where there is no arrangements, it's up to communities to actually, I suppose, organise themselves to look at who their community leaders are, but to gather themselves as well and bring in all key stakeholders as they see fit. But in doing so, there will be support given to them to make that happen. So it can be very different for people or communities that don't have any existing arrangements at the moment. But I think in New South Wales, where we already have the LDM, there are some really well set up, established alliances that could take advantage of this process.
And Chris, I wonder if you want to weigh in, although you kind of started this bit off about where the starting point is.
Yeah, the transitional arrangements and communities and regions that don't have any arrangements in place, it's going to take a little bit for them to get established and effective. But what the voice would allow the federal government to support communities and enable communities to do that. Where in the past it's been left up to the communities initiative and their lobbying of government to create something like empowered communities, where this would allow, as I said, hopefully both the federal government and state and territory governments to really enable communities to set up their place-based voice.
We've got a question that's come through from Gary Powell. There's some discussion about the voice of Anangu across the tri-state region at the bottom of the NT, South Australia and Western Australia. The interim design outlines a model that uses state and territory borders. I might come to Pete on that one first. I do understand that there's an APY lands consultation next week. The details of that are on voice.nia.gov.au. And I wondered about this component, Peter, about whether it might be possible on a case-by-case basis like that to have something that is a different model that perhaps is not around state territory borders.
Well, in these consultations, and you're right, we'll be in the APY lands next week, and Gary, I'll catch up with you when we're up there, I'm sure. But it's really important that if the Anangu are saying there are some issues around the cross-border arrangements, well, then we will listen to them. But it's important that the Anangu themselves identify what the issues are around only being available in the jurisdiction. So we know there is a tri-state arrangement and that the Central Australian communities do go across borders outside the West Australian, Northern Territory and South Australian jurisdiction. So we will be listening to those people that are coming to the consultation and to submissions being made, because we know that will be a real live issue in Central Australia. However, our initial work will be with state and territory jurisdictions to also work with the Indigenous communities about creating the capacity for them to work across jurisdictions that are supported by jurisdictions and giving the resources, I suppose, that's going to enable people to do that. But you're right, our model at the moment talks about structures within jurisdictions, but at the end of the day, I suppose we will be responding to the voices that we're hearing through consultation.
And I guess the point that's really important there is about getting your voice heard in this process. So if you can get to those consultations, absolutely do, but also join these webinars, another one tomorrow and some other conversations happening, but also put a submission in at voice.nia.gov.au. I wonder, Ruth and Chris, if you also want to weigh in on that around where there might be border issues because it's a tri-state area or a dual state area in other parts of the country.
I think if I can add, sorry, Ruth.
Yeah, go.
in the report, it's quite clear that the regions will be made up based on demographics or population, the history of the area, plus cultural boundaries as well. And I think if the Central Australia mob in those areas that have tri-state arrangements or deal with the 3 state and territory governments, they have a very strong case of why their region and what for them, they have a strong case that they will probably cross or should cross state and territory boundaries. But I think as pointed to, it's quite important that individuals and organisations place that in the submission so they're heard.
And Dan, I just want to point out that in the process, we do have a committee that's looking at linkages from, within the national work we're doing and the local and regional work, and the work that we're doing with governments, local and regional, state. And so we would be also hoping that we would get advice on how you can link up those like organisations and language groups that go across state and territory jurisdictions, because it is an issue. Governments aren't working as close together as they possibly should have to support those regional, cross-jurisdictional Aboriginal voices that want to relate to their own state governments and territory governments, but also want to collectively come together for the common good of their whole distributed community.
Ruth, did you want to jump in on that one as well?
I cannot add to that. No, Peter was talking about the linkages group, so no, cannot do anything.
We've got a question here that maybe we'll start with you on this one, Ruth. Wendy from Curranella Aboriginal Corporation on Dharawal land. How will the decision be made on who is the voice at a local level? Will Aboriginal people vote or government decide?
Again, that's up for discussion here. We've got some proposals there in the discussion paper or in the interim paper that you talk of, Dan. But it's up to discussion now, and it's community led. This is to be opened and led by communities. They need to organise themselves in a way that they can take up this opportunity. And I think, we've got community leaders out there, I think, in all of our communities, and I sit in New South Wales. I can't speak for all of Australia here, but when we have communities that hear their voice, that they see themselves reflected in these processes, that's the only way that this is going to work. So this is the opportunity for us now as Indigenous people, as Aboriginal First Nations people, to put our voices forward. I find this as a very exciting opportunity because, again, in the past, we've had some initiatives take place, but government's never going to go away. Government's always going to be there, and we have to effectively work out how we can have partnerships and effective partnerships together. So Aboriginal people, we need to get active and put our submissions in. There's surveys available as well, but make sure that your voice is heard.
And Wendy also added, when will the government have to ask the voice for advice? And could the government choose to ignore? I'm not sure who might want to start on that one.
I can kick that off. It depends. So the national voice, the government will need, potentially, if the national voice is to both government and parliament, they will set up arrangements where they'll provide advice. It is an advisory body. From my understanding, the national voice to parliament will also provide advice on legislation that affects Aboriginal people or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But at a local and regional level, it's around building the relationship between communities leadership, communities in general, Aboriginal communities in general, and the government. So the government, can ask for advice. Whether they take it or not is another thing. But what we're seeing now is the Australian government, with the previous Prime Minister's commitment to do things with Aboriginal communities, not to Aboriginal people, is really important. So it's around the government realising that Aboriginal people are the experts on issues affecting Aboriginal people within a community. So I'll be surprised if they ask for advice and they don't take it up. So I'm hoping, and I'm a half glass full kind of guy, and in my experience, you increase the relationship and community's leadership and governance, the government takes that serious.
Well, and Ruth, I wonder if there will be a bit of an impetus on government to be taking that advice, particularly if local groups have publicised in their local community the advice that they're giving, or to some way of almost a check and balance like that.
That's exactly right. I mean, this is, again, it's about holding government to account as well. It's also about the closing the gap strategies. We know that outcomes for Aboriginal people are lesser than what they should be. Government would be stupid to not be taking our advice. This is about the betterment of all as well, especially, again, coming from the Riverina Murray Regional Alliance. I believe that government is in a position to they hold the power, and unless we put our issues forth, what our challenges are, then they'll never know about that either. So it is, I keep saying, it's about working in partnership. We can't work alone. They can't work alone. So we have to be working together, walking side by side in this journey. And, I can't stress that enough.
Peter, I wonder if you want to weigh into that.
Yeah, Dan, the government's asked us a question of what would the structure of a voice look like. And so the principle of starting at the local and regional level and then moving to a national body made up of representatives from the local and regional groups is really important that people have their input into what that voice might look like, because it'll be the voice in the end of the day that will facilitate the priorities at the local and regional level percolating up to the national level, and then informing the Parliament of what we think the issues are. So when they're developing policies and programs, they need to co-design that or have that informed by our voices. We could be coming up with an election soon. So I think here's an opportunity for our voices to influence what the major parties might put forward as a platform for working with Indigenous peoples. And so we're looking at the principle of co-designed, inclusive participation of our communities that they can consult with and be very clear on what that structure might look like, and invest in it. And that we want to have a whole of government approach to it. It's everyone's business, as we say, but it's hard to see where it gets picked up sometimes, between the local, state and territory jurisdictions and, of course, the Australian government. Because I think they're all falling down on their commitment to us in their lack of ability to coordinate and to engage with us in a really proactive way. And so here's an opportunity for us to develop a proposal and describe what that should look like. What governments respond to, really, we don't know. But let's put up a really strong model that's been informed by our mob.
Ruth, where I grew up in Tennant Creek, you would often see some programs that were funded by the federal government, some by the territory government, some by local government, community, charity groups in there, with some of those programs overlapping and really trying to compete to do the same work. Would you see the voice as having a role in, synchronising all of that?
I do. Again, I speak for New South Wales, but there's lots of communities here saying there's up to 120 to 140 different services entering their communities, offering a lot of the time the same service. So yeah, there is, and I think there's groups that are getting a lot of money for Aboriginal services, but outcomes aren't actually hitting the ground. So I do think that by doing something like this, it will collaborate, it will coordinate. And we will have a better service being delivered to communities because it's driven by us.
Chris, there's also a question of trust, isn't there? You, like me, I'm sure, and everyone that's on the panel, and probably everyone who's listening today, has had issues around trust of governance structures, whatever stripes they be, at whatever level in Australia. Do you see the voices having a role in perhaps rebuilding or restoring that trust?
Yeah, well, firstly, from the research that Peter and Ruth talked about before, it looked at all the different governance arrangements in the past, NAC, ATSIC, the Congress, and the majority of the times it was a one-size-fits-all arrangement. It was put to Aboriginal people, where with the Indigenous voice and what's being proposed, it's about local communities, place-based designing their structure themselves, and what the region looks like. So ultimately what the report's doing is asking community, and that's why it's so important for Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people, but mainly Aboriginal people and communities to be able to make submissions on what a voice would look like in their community. And I must say, even just in New South Wales, which I'm quite familiar with, local voices will look different across different communities because, as I said, it's all about place-based design. And that's where I think that's important. That's what I see puts the Indigenous voice, or what is being proposed, different to all other governance arrangements that have come and gone at the whim or at the decision of government of the day.
Peter, do you want to jump in on that one as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important that in our consultations, people really provide us with advice about that local and regional membership, and the types of, they'll be electing their leaders. So it needs to be a combination, I would imagine, of cultural leaders, of leaders of organisations that reflect the priorities established by their local or regional governance arrangements, and then find a process of how we elect people or appoint people to that regional group that can take their voices up to the national voice, whatever that might look like at the end of the day. But as I said, we have that linkages group that's really looking at that relationship between regional and national, and ensuring that we get those linkages right and have a really strong communication strategy in place and decision-making strategy that allows for those local voices not to be dismissed once they leave those regions or local environments.
Because Ruth, you're probably hearing it in your community as much as anyone, that there are concerns that this will be a big process with lots of consultations, discussions, but that there might not be anything that comes from it, or like ATSIC, that it might be scrapped later on. What do you say when people have those sorts of concerns based on what has happened?
I say we have to give it a go. I say that there is, again, I'll say that the government is always going to be there, and we have to find the most effective way to work together. And I'll stress the work together thing, because it's not about government dictating to us and delivering those programs that we spoke about before, Dan. It's about us being able to say, this is what's lacking in our community. This is what's really good in our community, and we want to build on that. As I said, government would through my rose-coloured glasses, I can't see why government would not want to better their outcomes by working in partnership with us. That's what I tell people.
Yeah, and do you want to jump in on that, Peter?
Yeah, and as I was saying, this is not replacing anything. So we have this wonderful agreement with Close the Gap, in what Pat Turner's been able to, negotiate with the federal government on Close the Gap. And as I said, this voice won't be delivering services. So we have to engage with those that already exist, such as the Close the Gap partnership that has been established by that national group, because we will need to work and garnish the support and bring our voices in the collective tent. And really appreciate the role of the partnering agreement is to deliver on those identified targets within the Close the Gap. Our voice is broader than just delivering services to the community. It's addressing other issues, such as the treaty about making process. Some states are further down the track, the other, and doing other things. It's about truth telling. It's about having a voice that governments can go to start to progress other areas that have been set by our communities, such as the Uluru Statement. We haven't dismissed that. what we're saying, that we're addressing the first part of that, is what Minister White has asked us to have a look at. And that is, what is the structure of a voice and how would you bring local and regional voices up to a national voice that would work constructively with the Australian Parliament and the government? And so we're very clear that if we get this structure right at the local level and regional level, we can start to advance those other things that are continually priorities that we've been setting over a number of years. It's not either or, it's a complementary process of ensuring we've got the structure on the voice that's inclusive of participation, that's going to engage our diversity of our young people, people with disabilities, and other people with special needs, or needs that goes to the heart of who they are as Aboriginal people, and then work together to get a voice that can be coherent and strong and is based on evidence and data that comes out of our communities.
In that sense, Chris, is this essentially a step as part of a broader, longer journey?
I personally see it as that. I see if a national voice is established, even though, our job, as Peter said, is to establish a voice. Through different forums, our mob have said what their aspirations are moving forward. And as I said, personally, I see if we have the national voice, that's going to be a strong group that can advocate for regions and local communities throughout Australia. I'm pretty excited. I like that. I'm always interested in the way that government's influenced, and I just see the national voice being, as I said, a really strong body and a group of people that can do that for our mob.
Mm. And we got a question in here from Joanne. I'll start with you, Peter, on this one. How can local government associations become more engaged with the local and regional voice process?
We started that work by having local government association being part of the broader stakeholder engagement work that the national group is doing. That is Marcia and Tom themselves as co-chairs of the senior advisory group, sitting with senior officers, from state and territory jurisdictions, as well as the Australian Local Government Association. And I suppose those agencies that are from states and territories that belong to that officials group are coming back and also engaging in their local and state local government associations, because I want to really pursue that when we finish our consultations, because that was such a big issue everywhere we went last week, where people were really critical of local and government participation. I wrote to a number of local government associations to attend our consultations last week, and in Murray Bridge, for example, the Murray Bridge local government couldn't even turn up. But then I also learned there are a number of other from the local community. There are a number of other local government regions or associations that are a part of, say, the Murraylands, and but they weren't there either. So I know we need to focus very much on that local government association and say, how can we get involved in your voices, and what are you doing to increase the participation of our people in, say, local government elections? Is an example that came out of the Murray Bridge consultation. A lot of people there have tried to stand for local government, but unfortunately, when you go to the election model, only the biggest mob with the biggest mob of votes get in. And of course, if you're the minority in that particular community, you're not going to get elected onto those local government.
So what sort of models would you be considering around that of how to engage or become involved in your local voice? Is it through elections, appointments? What do you see as possible models?
Well, I think there's got to be a real stronger education program with the local government association, and really indicate how these are the things you should be doing to engage with your local community. Like, you've got to seek out the leaders. You've got to invite people to be part of the processes. We understand the power of local governments in terms of, or they certainly did in Murray Bridge, for example, of planning laws, of engaging, with building roads, etc., allocating land, for development. And they want to be involved in that because some of the lands that they think they need to influence, their voice is not being heard on how should that land benefit the priorities of the local language group or the cultural authority. And they want to teach local governments more about their connections to country and why it is important to them to be involved in the local government processes.
Ruth, what about you? What do you think are ways that you could have of becoming involved around perhaps election appointment? There are other options as well. What do you think?
I speak from experience. I actually ran for elections a few years ago as well. And, I think we do, if we don't understand the rules of government and how their preference votes and things like that work as well, you'll never get in as an individual or an independent person because it's the party ticket, so to speak. So I think we as Aboriginal people need to knowledge ourselves up, actually learn the processes of that as well, and learn, educate ourselves around whether it's an advisory that you need in your local area or whether it's something more than that and actually becoming a councillor. But I think, on top of what Peter's saying, the councils need to be seeking out leaders and seeking out community to partake in the council. But I think we also have a little role to play in educating ourselves with more information about what councils do, how do we become a councillor, or even, is there a position for advisory as such?
Chris, do you want to weigh in on that one as well?
I just think it's important the way that whether it's local government, state government or federal government, we put their influence of political parties. I think it's important and some of that with the local communities be able to work with government around what their aspirations are. A lot of communities look at leadership and investing in young people around leadership. And in my community, we've had a successful leadership program where we're investing in young people through education, their schooling all the way up to make them to be the best that they can be as a community. And I think it's quite important that by investing in our young people and people within our community, it gives them the best opportunity if they want to run for public office. And the reason I say that is, as we all face in our communities a lot of crisis, and what I've seen is through the effective governance arrangements and leadership and working with government, it starts to decrease crisis within community. And it allows us to look forward and do some forward thinking around our own mob and investing in our own people because they are the future of our community. And you don't want us to do all this work and in 2 generations' time, our grandchildren are dealing with the same issue that we're dealing with today. However, I think the most effective that we can be into the future is getting more of our people in that public service or public officials, whether it's local, state or federal government, to really make a difference and represent us.
Well, off the back of that, and Ruth, I think responding to your comments before, Tony has weighed in, should we be advocating for designated seats on local, state and national governments commensurate with the percentage of First Nations populations within those jurisdictions?
Good question. I think it'd probably come down to each community to think about that because you've got a lot of local governments that cover off on those communities. So I think it's a question to ask your community leaders and your community itself.
Peter, there will be people listening to this today who have varying levels of connection to culture, to country as a direct impact of policies of this country of the past. There's been some discussion around how you might get involved in these in your local community if you don't have that direct or very strong connection to land and culture.
Absolutely right, Dan. And that's a real issue that we're having a conversation within the local regional group. What do we do for our people that don't live on country? That are not part of the traditional language group people, not a part of, the native title type TO group, but live on country and have for generations, and but are not originally from there. And for this voice to be inclusive, we've got to have a strategy at the local level on how do you involve that diversity of people in your regional area. And it's like the local government, go back to the local government question, where there is a large populations of Aboriginal language people, language groups, that might look different in areas of the Northern Territory and local government area than, say, a city region within Adelaide. What happens on the west coast of this state, because of the numbers of people that are there, will reflect different in terms of the strategy you might have to involve people in local government processes. And I think that's why it's really important that we look at the capacity to be really flexible at that local regional level, and to ensure that part of this is to have a strong interface, between the community and local government. But that will look differently based on the population and geographical numbers of our mob where they are.
Ruth, what do you say about that component around the varying levels of connection to culture, to country, based on things out of our control?
I think it doesn't matter whether you're off country or not. You've often got family still on country. You're still connected to country. I think that there's, in every aspect of this, people should be able to see themselves and be able to feel included in the process. That's my very, very short answer.
Chris, that inclusivity, how important is that as kind of underpinning this process?
Yeah, I think that, Minister White made it quite clear that this is about every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person having a voice. So it's quite important for local communities, when they're designing their local voice, is to make sure that they have the ability to capture voices. And I don't want to go too far in the thinking, but communities really need to look at what is their representation at the moment, and how does someone that's not traditionally from the area, that lives within the area, how do they have the opportunity to be involved and have a say if they want to have a say? Don't get me wrong, there's going to be Aboriginal people that just don't want to say. They're just living their life as they do, but there'll be others that want to contribute and be heard. And if that's not back where they're from, how does the local community where they live enable them to do so? Enable them to have a voice. So that's where I think that's one of the questions that we're asking communities, is to make sure when they're thinking around what a local voice looks like, how does everyone get to say, to have a voice? And in some of our consultations, the question came up in the stolen generation, for the stolen generation survivors, where there's 33,600 stolen gen survivors left across Australia, but they don't feel that they're totally accepted or with the community that they're from or that they're living in. So they said it's quite important that they have a voice as well. So that's going to be an important question that everyone needs to address.
Ruth, I'll come to you in a moment to kick off our kind of final comments from all of the panel, but I wonder if the point, or part of the point, Chris, there for broader consideration is around the ability to have the voice and be listened. It's your own option and choice of whether you want to speak up, but that's the empowerment component, isn't it, about actually having that choice yourself of whether you want to speak up, and if you do, you'll be heard.
Yeah, and people are comfortable if they're within a community or they're a part of a community or live, near a community. They might be comfortable with who the leaders of that community speaking on their behalf. So, yeah, it's quite important that this is really an opt-in, opt-out scenario for not just organisations and others, but also for individuals.
Ruth, do you want to kick us off on our kind of final thoughts? I am a touch over time, apologies, but do stick with me. We're getting close to the end of this conversation, of course, just part of a whole series of chats that are being had right now. Ruth?
My closing comments would be, I think it's a very exciting time. Once again, I think that, this is an option for us to be able to put our our thoughts forward, what our challenges are, what our issues are. But also, I think that it is open to everybody. That's Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but I very much encourage all people to be having a conversation, especially our own people, in regards to, going home and having a conversation about this, because this is a chance for us to have a voice and to continue to have that voice.
Peter, your final thoughts on this chat?
Yeah, so I encourage everyone to have the conversation around the kitchen table, in your lounge rooms, at your barbies in your backyard, about the importance of getting involved in our movement, because we really need to take this forward. And the more people we have involved in it, the stronger our voice will be. And the principle is that we want it to be inclusive. We don't want any of our communities or individuals to feel marginalised. And that's why we have a principle-based approach, not describing exactly what the structure should look like, but to really invite you to write your submission, to fill out the survey. For us, there is so much information we know that we have to internalise in terms of responding to the questions that we're asking. But we're really prepared to listen to your voices, because it is a co-design process. So I really encourage people to get involved.
Yeah, and I'll give you all the details on where to engage and how to become more involved in this discussion in a moment. But Chris, just to round us out, any final thoughts?
Like Ruth and Peter, I'll just encourage people to get involved. If non-Aboriginal people that may be on this webinar, assist get the word out amongst your friends and family, as well as the Aboriginal communities you may work in, and Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people that are on the webinar. I would encourage you to make a submission, fill out a survey, and get your mob involved, so your voice is heard, what's best for your community and what's best for the future of your children and grandchildren. And I think it's important that everyone gets involved in this process.
Yeah, a perfect way to place us at the end of this chat today. Of course, not the end of the bigger conversation. Chris, thank you so much. Ruth and Peter, great to have you along, and to really appreciate the insights of all of you and the work that you've been doing to get us to this point as well. So thank you very much for that and for joining us today. Now, from here, there's just a couple of weeks left to get your submissions, and you can get all that extra information at voice.niaa.gov.au. Now, there is a survey that's open. There's a way to give broader submissions if there are components of the proposals that you don't think work or that you don't like. Pop that in as well if you think there are areas that do work and would be great, or combinations. Put that all in, because this is about getting all of those ideas on the table. And the paradox, of course, is that having a voice now in this process will help inform what the voice becomes and where to from here. Thank you so very much for joining me. So I hope you'll be with me again tomorrow and getting involved on the website or in one of those face-to-face gatherings as well. Yara, good afternoon.